Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. My name is Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada. And this is going to be the first in a series of 3 videos, short videos, unpacking some of the themes from Chapter 4 of my book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. And Chapter 4 is titled Imagination in Idealism After the COVID-19 Pandemic. So in this first video, I'm going to focus just on imagination. What is imagination and how does it factor both into science, but also into bioethical discussions about the likely societal impact of translational science? The next video will be on Christian Herder and the plasticity of science, followed by a video that surveys briefly some of the experimental research on the biology of aging over the past century that has moved translational gerontology from the bench to the clinic. Right? The human mind is capable of conjuring up opinions about the pros and cons of translational science in ways that are both utopic and dystopic. And this can range from vaccinations to genome editing and interventions in aging. Right? So an enthusiast of vaccinations, for example, may overestimate or overpredict the efficacy of the innovation. It may over-idealize the adverse side effects. And conversely, somebody who's a vaccine skeptic might invoke imagination in a way that over-catastrophizes what they think the potential adverse side effects will be, or they grossly underestimate the efficacy of the vaccinations in terms of reducing serious disease and mortality. So our imagination, while it's very critical to the scientific endeavor and to bioethical discussions of biomedical research, it needs to be constrained so that it is invoked in an empirically informed and valid fashion. And as William James, one of the pragmatists that informs my approach to this topic, reminds us, the default setting for humans with most issues is like under our hat is a chaotic view, all the biases and emotional knee-jerk reactions we have to various scenarios. And James reminds us that the role of the philosopher is to provide a more rational frame so that we can have a more sensible discussion about how to sagely navigate through the promises and perils of, in my case, translational science. And this insight was also invoked by my favorite pragmatist, John Dewey, who reminds us, and he wrote this over 100 years ago, but I would say it equally applies now in the 21st century, that science is still too recent to have been absorbed into our imaginative and emotional disposition. Right? So we still have a difficult time in processing the societal significance of science, ranging from climate science to artificial intelligence or innovations in public health. So let's first start off with what is imagination. And this definition by Marjorie Taylor, I think, is a concise and very instructive and helpful one. It's the capacity to mentally transcend time, place, and or circumstance to think about what might have been, to plan and anticipate the future, create fictional worlds, consider remote and close alternatives to actual experiences. And throughout my book, I invoke different examples of imagination in medical science, both the role of imagination that was invoked in Winslow's War Against Disease, where the aspiration was to imagine a future where we have conquered all of the infectious diseases responsible for early life mortality, and then Richard Nixon's War Against Cancer, again, envisioning a future where cancer mortality is being eradicated. And when it comes to translational gerontology, there's been a plurality of different invocations of imagination. And the one that I try to emphasize for the reader to focus on is just trying to increase health span and compress the period in late life where we manage multimorbidity, frailty, and disability. And I also invoke 6 distinct societal benefits that will come from the realization of healthy longevity for the global population. Now, imagination is important both to the scientific enterprise itself. Without imagination, there would be no scientific enterprise. But it's also critical to bioethical and philosophical discussions about translational science, because the philosopher is going to be deploying an ethical analysis that addresses potential benefits and harms. And so it's critical that as a philosopher, one also critically reflect on the way in which they are actually deploying their own imagination in deploying their ethical analysis of translational science. So let me start first with the role of imagination in science itself. There's a long history of prominent scientists that emphasize the importance of science. And I think the best example of this is the Irish physicist John Tyndall, who back in 1870 published on the scientific use of the imagination. And he argued that bounded and conditioned by cooperative reason, imagination becomes the mightiest instrument of the physical discoverer, right? So without imagination, we would not have physics or chemistry, for example. Without this power, our knowledge of nature would be a mere tabulation of coexistences and sequences, right? And I want to supplement Tyndall's passage with another great one from John Dewey. I think this is my all-time favorite passage by Dewey, that knowledge falters when imagination clips its wings or fears to use them. Every great advance in science has issued from a new audacity of imagination. What are now working conceptions, employed as a matter of course because they have withstood the tests of experiment and have emerged triumphant, were once speculative hypotheses, right? So it's really critical that we put forth speculative hypotheses, but then we rigorously test them empirically to see if they are valid or not. And most of these hypotheses will be discarded as not being validated by experimentation. But for those that do, this is where the critical advance is made in knowledge in translational science. And so it's really critical that we emphasize and celebrate the role of imagination in science, because we, as a culture, we don't want to obstruct or diminish the role of creative imagination in the scientific endeavor, right? So I think every student, and especially students of science, should be taught to value and nurture their imagination and creativity, because that is going to be the critical skill in the toolbox for addressing the challenges of the 21st century. Now, I want to argue that progress in medical science really takes place on I'm going to describe it as two staircases. And the first one is the one that most of us are familiar with when we think about medical science and we hear about studies published in prominent scientific journals. This is the empirical arm of progress in medical science. It's the gathering of data concerning the efficacy and safety of a particular intervention. So in public health, this might be a new drug, a medical procedure, or behavior change. And you have to employ rigorous experimentation to replicate the data that this particular innovation is safe and effective, it's better than other existing interventions, and then it then gets authorization and becomes part of standard clinical treatment. But there's another staircase, and this is the one that I want to emphasize in this video. But with respect to this first one, it's also important to recognize that it's not a simple, one step up all the time. It's often two steps forward, one step back. Sometimes new data comes out that there's perhaps more adverse side effects than initially anticipated, or the efficacy of a vaccination, for example, becomes less effective as mutations occur. So all of these things were relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in a way, this arm of science became politicized. And, we all know how that played out with various critics on both the left and the right concerning public health measures for COVID-19. But I'm more interested in this second staircase, the one that comes before. So before a drug or an intervention non-pharmacological intervention can be tested, somebody has to come up with the idea that, hey, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could develop a vaccination against a particular infectious disease. So this second staircase is the one where imagination and idealism occurs. It's where the scientist comes up with the idea that you may be able to develop, for example, a vaccination, or in the case of translational gerontology, a molecule that mimics the effects of caloric restriction for realizing the end of healthy longevity. And this was the focus of a article in 1910 by Christian Herder. I just happened to come across this Herder article. I was doing some research on the archives of old articles in medical science, and the title stuck out at me. I read it, and I was like, oh, it's one of those moments where it crystallizes ideas that you've been struggling to formulate. And I realized, over 100 years ago, there was this brilliant physician and scientist who was already ahead of his time in terms of thinking about the role of imagination in idealism in medical science. So in the next video, I'm going to unpack more detail about Christian Herder himself and specifically what he argues. But broadly speaking, what I want to suggest is that when we invoke the idealism of the war against disease, we'll think that the initial obvious thing to pursue is to be prepared for the next pandemic. And that, of course, was what the World Health Organization prioritized right as the COVID-19 pandemic was winding down. It said, well, and I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be prepared for the next COVID-19 pandemic or a pandemic of any kind, but I think it would be short-sighted to lose the bigger picture of the highest risk factor for COVID-19 mortality and serious illness was advanced age. And in an aging world, not only infectious disease, but the chronic diseases are now responsible for most of the mortality in the world. And so I think we need to prime the idealism and imagination of healthy aging. And this is something that medical science is still in the embryonic stages of developing. So we don't have something like pandemic preparedness for healthy aging. Healthy aging is not, aging is not an infectious disease. It requires a reconceptualizing around how we communicate what its aspirations are and the various interventions, both non-pharmacological and potentially pharmacological, that could be deployed to improve the health prospects of the world's aging populations. And the philosopher of science, Philip Kitcher, describes well-ordered science as being oriented towards answering the questions that are most significant. And the first approach to longevity science presupposed that the most important questions to answer fixated on the causation of pathology. And this has helped us achieve life expectancy beyond the 7th decade of life by eradicating smallpox, getting a better understanding of other infectious diseases, and including chronic conditions. But what I'm suggesting in the 21st century is that the most significant question to answer may not actually be fixating on a specific disease, but instead trying to resolve the puzzle of how some centenarians can survive 100 years disease-free from the conditions that afflict most people in the 7th, 8th decade of life. So the geroscience hypothesis, which conjectures, it's a hypothesis that we may be able to intentionally modulate the rate of aging to increase health span and compress morbidity in late life. That, I would argue, should be emerging as the most significant question for medical science in an aging world, and to relax some of the fixation we have on pathology research, which is at risk of devolving into a knowledge inquiry versus a wisdom inquiry mindset. Because of aging is implicated in most of the chronic conditions, if we just continue to target one at a time each of these specific diseases. we're going to be pushing survival into ages where people are more vulnerable to debilitating conditions like Alzheimer's disease. So the geroscience hypothesis will be the focus of the third video I post on this chapter of the book. And I want to finish, just as a way of foreshadowing Christian Herter's piece, with this quotation from Elastic, Unlocking Your Brain's Ability to Embrace Change. Really what I'm arguing for the role of imagination in medical science is our ability to pivot and to have a plastic mindset with respect to the aspirations of medical science. So this is described, having an elastic mind is described as the capacity to let go of comfortable ideas and become accustomed to ambiguity and contradiction. The ability to rise above conventional mindsets and to reframe the questions we ask, right? So what I'm suggesting is that we relax the fixation on trying to conquer every disease of late life and be open instead to the question of how can some people survive decades of more healthy life? And let's try to mimic the biology that occurs in these exceptional superagers rather than trying to understand pathology in all of its intricate detail. The ability to abandon our ingrained assumptions and open ourselves to new paradigms. And the geroscience hypothesis is the new paradigm for medical science in the 21st century. And the propensity to rely on imagination as much as on logic and to generate and integrate a wide variety of ideas, and the willingness to experiment and be tolerant of failure. So Winslow's war against disease was a new paradigm in the early 20th century, and it did face setbacks and failures, but we tolerated those. And fortunately for us, we did, because now we've been able to push life expectancy beyond the 7th decade of life. Similarly, we should adopt a similar approach to translational gerontology, which is moving from the bench to the clinic. It's an experimental approach to promoting healthy longevity. It will face its setbacks and failures. We should try to mitigate the vulnerability and risks that may come with this experimentation, but we should not have a closed mindset to pursuing the aspiration of healthy longevity, because we're going to be exacerbating the gap between health span and lifespan if we don't adopt this kind of plastic or elastic mindset with respect to the aspirations of medical science. So that is it for this first video from chapter 4. I'm going to be continuing on with the discussion of the plasticity of science in the next video, where I'll do a deeper dive into who Christian Herter was and what he argued. And then the third video will briefly survey some of the fascinating research in geroscience over the last century.